October 27th, 1962, 4:15 a.m., beneath the Sargasso Sea. The air inside submarine B-59 had become poison. Captain Valentin Savitsky pressed a handkerchief against his nose, but it did nothing to filter the carbon dioxide that hung thick as fog in the compartments. The temperature had climbed to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Men lay sprawled across pipes and torpedo racks, their uniforms soaked through, their breathing shallow. Some had stopped moving altogether, and in the red emergency lighting it was difficult to tell who was unconscious and who was simply conserving oxygen. Above them, somewhere in the darkness of the Atlantic, American destroyers circled. Their sonar pinged against B-59's hull, a metallic heartbeat that never stopped, never slowed. Ping, ping, ping. The sound had been continuous for nearly 4 hours now, drilling into the skull of every man aboard. Savitsky stood at the periscope station, his knuckles white against the rail, watching his executive officer, Vasili Arkhipov, check the atmospheric sensors for the 11th time that hour. The submarine had been submerged for 22 hours. Standard protocol called for surfacing every 8. The batteries were dying, the air scrubbers had failed, radio contact with Moscow had been lost 2 days ago, and now the Americans were dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant to force them to the surface. Each detonation shook the hull like the fist of an angry god. In the weapons bay, locked in its cradle behind a steel door marked with radiation warnings, a single nuclear torpedo waited. Its yield, 15 kilotons, roughly the size of the bomb that had erased Hiroshima. Savitsky looked at the torpedo bay door, then at the clock mounted above the navigation station. Moscow's standing orders were clear. If communications were lost and the Americans attacked, if the submarine faced imminent destruction, the captain was authorized to use all available weapons. He did not need permission from the Kremlin. He did not need confirmation of war. The decision was his alone, or so he believed. What Captain Savitsky did not know, what no one in Moscow had bothered to tell him, was that B-59 carried a third officer whose approval was required for nuclear launch. Brigade Chief of Staff Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov, standing 5 feet away in the suffocating darkness, held a veto that could not be overridden. And in the next 30 minutes, that veto would become the only thing standing between human civilization and nuclear holocaust. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the most extensively documented near-apocalypse in human history, but for decades, one story remained buried in Soviet naval archives, classified under protocols so strict that even Kremlin historians could not access the files. The official narrative, carefully constructed by both Washington and Moscow in the aftermath of October 1962, focused on Kennedy and Khrushchev, on diplomatic cables and UN speeches, on the visible chess game played out in newspapers and television broadcasts worldwide. What happened aboard submarine B-59 was not mentioned in Kennedy's memoirs, not discussed in Khrushchev's rambling autobiographical dictations, not analyzed by the armies of political scientists who dissected every other aspect of the crisis. The Soviet Navy had deployed 4 Foxtrot-class submarines to Cuban waters in early October, part of Operation Kama. Their mission was straightforward: establish a deterrent presence, protect Soviet supply ships, and demonstrate Moscow's commitment to defending Cuba. Each submarine carried 22 torpedoes. This was public knowledge, or at least knowledge that Western intelligence could easily deduce. What was not public, what was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Soviet Union, was that 1 torpedo on each submarine was special. Project codename, KIT. The weapons were T-5 torpedoes modified to carry a nuclear warhead, 15 kilotons of thermonuclear fury that could vaporize an aircraft carrier and everything within a 2-mile radius. The authorization protocols for these weapons had been drawn up hastily, modified from protocols designed for strategic bombers. In the event of war, submarine captains had the authority to launch, but there was ambiguity, intentional or accidental, historians still debate, about what constituted war. Was it a formal declaration? Was it the loss of communications? Was it being attacked? The orders, stamped and sealed in Moscow, gave the submarine captains discretion that would have been unthinkable for any other weapon system. ICBM commanders needed dual authentication codes from the Kremlin. Strategic bomber pilots required verified orders transmitted through multiple redundant channels. But submarine captains, cut off from communications by the nature of their environment, were given operational authority that made them, in effect, independent nuclear powers. The 4 submarines departed their base at Saida Guba on October 1, 1962. B-59, under Captain Savitsky's command, was the oldest boat in the flotilla, commissioned in 1961 but already showing signs of mechanical unreliability. Savitsky himself was a decorated officer, 44 years old, a veteran of Arctic patrols who had earned his command through competence and political reliability. His service record, later declassified by Russian naval historians, shows 14 commendations and 2 reprimands, one for excessive consumption of alcohol while in port, and one for striking a subordinate officer. He was known among his crews as a captain who demanded perfection and who accepted nothing less than complete obedience. Vasili Arkhipov represented something different. At 36, he was younger than Savitsky, but carried equal rank within the naval hierarchy. He had been assigned to B-59 as Flotilla Chief of Staff, a position that technically placed him outside the submarine's direct chain of command. He was an observer, an advisor, a political commissar without the political commissar's title. His presence was standard for important missions. Someone from headquarters keeping an eye on things, someone who could provide counsel to the captain, someone who understood the broader strategic picture. What made Arkhipov unique? What made him the wild card in the carefully structured Soviet command system was his recent history. 11 months earlier, he had been executive officer aboard K-19, a nuclear submarine that suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant failure during exercises in the North Atlantic. The reactor core had begun to melt down. Radiation levels in the engine compartment exceeded lethal limits within minutes. Arkhipov had led the damage control team personally, organizing a desperate repair operation that required men to enter the reactor space in shifts, each man absorbing a fatal dose of radiation to buy a few minutes of work time. 8 men died within days. 15 more died within 2 years. Arkhipov himself had absorbed enough radiation to develop chronic health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. But he had saved the submarine and prevented a nuclear explosion that would have contaminated the North Atlantic and potentially triggered a war. That experience had marked him. Officers who served with him after K-19 noted that he had become more cautious, more skeptical of orders, more willing to question protocols. He had seen what nuclear weapons could do, not in the abstract, but in the intimate horror of melted flesh and men vomiting blood onto steel deck plates. The psychological profile conducted by Soviet naval medical officers in January 1962 noted increased contemplative tendency and possible over-identification with consequences of nuclear engagement. The profile recommended desk duty. Arkhipov had instead requested assignment to Operation Kama. The Americans, meanwhile, knew about the submarines, but not about their special cargo. CIA surveillance had tracked the 4 Foxtrots leaving port, had plotted their probable courses, had dispatched hunter-killer groups to locate and monitor them. What Navy intelligence understood was that Soviet diesel submarines had a range of approximately 20,000 miles and a submerged endurance of about 10 days at patrol speed. What they did not understand was that these particular submarines were carrying weapons that could start World War III without any further authorization from Moscow. The blockade that Kennedy announced on October 22nd created the crisis. The quarantine line at 30 degrees north latitude became an invisible wall across the Atlantic. Soviet ships approaching Cuba would be stopped, boarded, searched. Khrushchev called it an act of piracy. Kennedy called it necessary defense. Neither man mentioned the submarines, though both knew they were there. The submarines became ghost pieces on the strategic board. Everyone knew they existed, no one knew exactly where they were, and no one could predict what they might do. By October 25th, all 4 submarines had crossed the quarantine line without detection. They were running deep, maintaining radio silence, moving toward their patrol stations off Cuba's northern coast. This was their advantage, invisibility. This was also their vulnerability, isolation. Without radio contact, they had no way of knowing whether war had already begun, whether Soviet cities were burning, whether the order for retaliation had already been given by commanders who assumed the submarines had been destroyed. The crisis aboard B-59 began not with an American attack, but with a mechanical failure that would have been merely inconvenient under normal circumstances, but became potentially catastrophic under the pressure of the quarantine. On October 26th, at approximately 1600 hours local time, the submarine's air regeneration system began malfunctioning. The chemical scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide from the recycled air were working at only 30% efficiency. Electrical systems were overheating, raising the internal temperature. Captain Savitsky faced an immediate choice: surface to ventilate and recharge batteries or continue submerged toward the patrol station. Surfacing meant revealing their position. It meant the possibility of being surrounded by American destroyers, forced to proceed to port under escort, the humiliation of failure. Savitsky's orders from Northern Fleet Command had been explicit. Maintain covert patrol, avoid detection at all costs, reach Station Papa 7 by October 28th. He had 48 hours. He decided to continue. By midnight on October 26th, conditions inside the submarine had deteriorated to dangerous levels. Carbon dioxide concentration had reached 3.5%, high enough to cause severe headaches, impaired judgment, and eventual loss of consciousness. The heat had become unbearable. Men were stripping off their uniforms, lying in their own sweat, drinking the last of the fresh water reserves. In the sonar compartment, technicians were reporting that American destroyers had established a search pattern directly above them. They were trapped, unable to surface without being detected, unable to remain submerged without suffocating. At 0200 hours on October 27th, the Americans began dropping the practice depth charges. The Navy destroyers USS Beale, USS Coney, and USS Murray had been tracking a magnetic anomaly for 6 hours, following what their sonar operators believed was a submarine contact. Their orders, transmitted from Atlantic Fleet Command, were to force the submarine to surface for identification. The practice depth charges, PDCs in Navy terminology, were 4.5-inch hand grenades with a 5-pound TNT charge designed to create a loud explosion without damaging a hull. The acoustic shockwave was supposed to be a message. We know you're down there. Come up or we'll drop something bigger. Inside B-59, the explosions sounded like the end of the world. Each detonation sent a shockwave through the hull, rattling pipes, knocking men from their bunks, creating a noise so loud that it physically hurt. Sonar operators ripped off their headphones, their eardrums bleeding. In the engine compartment, a coolant pipe cracked, spraying hot water across the reactor shielding. In the forward torpedo room, one of the conventional weapons partially armed itself. A mechanical failure triggered by vibration that brought the torpedo within one safety interlock of becoming live. Savitsky had been awake for 37 hours. His judgment was compromised by heat, by carbon dioxide poisoning, by stress, and now by what he interpreted as an attack. He called an emergency command conference in the control room. Present were himself, Executive Officer Arkhipov, Political Officer Ivan Maslenikov, and Navigator Mikhail Dubivko. The question was simple: what do we do? According to Vadim Orlov, B-59's communications officer, who documented the conversation in his personal diary, later published in the Russian naval journal Morskoy Spornik in 2002, Savitsky's position was unequivocal. They are dropping practice charges now, Savitsky said, but in 10 minutes they will drop real depth charges. We cannot surface. We will be captured or destroyed. Moscow is silent. For all we know, the war has already started. We have one option: use the special weapon, destroy the carrier group, complete the mission. The special weapon was the nuclear torpedo in the forward bay. Arkhipov, according to Orlov's account, immediately objected. We do not know that war has begun. We have lost radio contact, but that is not the same as confirmation of war. If we launch without confirmation, we may start the war ourselves. Maslenikov, the political officer, was supposed to be the ideological enforcer, the representative of Communist Party authority. His role in the nuclear weapons protocol was ambiguous. Some documents suggested he had veto power, others suggested he was merely advisory. According to Orlov, Maslenikov said nothing during the initial exchange. He sat at the navigation table, staring at the chart of the Atlantic, his hands shaking. Savitsky's response was documented in multiple sources, including Orlov's diary and later testimony from Arkhipov himself in classified debriefings. We will die here anyway, Savitsky said. The Americans are preparing to sink us. I would rather die taking our enemy with us than suffocate like rats. This is why we carry the special weapon. This is the moment Moscow prepared us for. The protocols for launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and in this case, the flotilla chief of staff. Savitsky had designed to launch. Maslenikov, after several minutes of silence, agreed. The standing orders seemed clear enough. If the submarine faced imminent destruction, all weapons were authorized. 2 votes for launch. 1 vote required to complete the authorization. Arkhipov refused. The conversation that followed has been reconstructed from multiple sources, including Orlov's diary, later interviews with Arkhipov conducted by Russian historians, and declassified Soviet naval records. It lasted approximately 20 minutes, though time estimates vary. Savitsky argued that they were under attack, that they were cut off from command, that they had a duty to strike back. Arkhipov argued that practice depth charges were not the same as real depth charges, that the Americans were trying to force them up rather than sink them, that launching a nuclear weapon without confirmed orders would be a catastrophic mistake. If we launch, Arkhipov said, according to Orlov's account, we kill not just the Americans above us, we kill ourselves, we kill Cuba, we kill Moscow, we kill everything. This is not defense, this is suicide and murder. Savitsky, according to multiple sources, grew enraged. He accused Arkhipov of cowardice, of betraying his duty, of prioritizing his own survival over the mission. He threatened to have Arkhipov relieved of duty, arrested, tried for treason. The argument escalated. Other officers in the control room backed away, uncertain whether they were witnessing a command dispute or a mutiny. What broke the deadlock was not eloquence or appeals to duty, but simple exhaustion. Savitsky, according to Arkhipov's later testimony, suddenly stopped shouting. He looked around the control room, at the men slumped against consoles, at the red emergency lighting, at the temperature gauge showing 122 degrees, at the carbon dioxide monitor flashing its warning. I cannot think clearly, he said. None of us can think clearly. We cannot make this decision in these conditions. At 04:45 hours, Captain Savitsky ordered B-59 to surface. The submarine broke the surface at 04:58 hours, approximately 3 miles from the USS Coney. Dawn was breaking across the Atlantic, the sky turning from black to deep blue, the ocean unusually calm. The American destroyers immediately converged, their spotlights illuminating B-59's conning tower. On the deck of the Coney, sailors stood at battle stations, uncertain whether they were looking at a disabled submarine or the beginning of a shooting war. Captain Savitsky emerged from the conning tower hatch, dressed in his formal uniform despite the heat, his face gaunt and pale. He was followed by Arkhipov and 12 other officers and crew members. They stood on the deck in the searchlight glare while American helicopters circled overhead and small boats approached from the destroyers. According to the declassified after-action report filed by Commander Charles Rozier of the USS Coney, the Soviet officers appeared to be in distress but maintained military bearing. No weapons were visible. No hostile actions were taken. What happened next was a negotiation conducted through hand signals, shouted English and Russian phrases, and eventually a translator brought by helicopter from the carrier USS Randolph. The Americans wanted to board the submarine. Savitsky refused. The Americans wanted to escort B-59 to a U.S. naval base. Savitsky refused. The Americans wanted, at minimum, to verify that the submarine was not carrying nuclear weapons. Savitsky refused this most emphatically of all, though he allowed American officers to conduct a visual inspection of the hull from small boats. The standoff lasted 6 hours. During this time, B-59's crew worked to repair the air scrubbers, recharge the batteries, and ventilate the compartments. Sailors brought up those who had lost consciousness below, laying them on the deck in the sunlight, forcing water down their throats. 2 men required medical evacuation, one with heat stroke, one with what appeared to be a heart attack. American medics were allowed aboard to treat them, working in the stifling heat of the submarine's interior while armed Soviet sailors watched their every move. The nuclear torpedo in the forward bay was never mentioned. The American boarding party did not enter the weapons compartment. The visual hull inspection did not reveal anything unusual. The T-5 nuclear torpedo looked identical to conventional torpedoes from the outside, its warhead indistinguishable without radiation detection equipment. If the Americans had brought Geiger counters, history might have been different. They did not. At 15-20 hours after the batteries had been charged and the air scrubbers repaired, Savitsky ordered his crew back inside. The Americans requested that B-59 proceed to the surface to a U.S. port. Savitsky responded through the translator that his orders required him to continue his mission. He thanked the Americans for their restraint and professionalism. Then B-59 submerged and set course back toward the Soviet Union. The message Savitsky transmitted to Northern Fleet Command upon re-establishing radio contact, later declassified in 1997, was brief. Submarine B-59 forced to surface due to mechanical difficulties. No hostile action taken. Americans conducted visual inspection but did not board. Air systems repaired. Returning to base per standing orders for mechanical failures. Request guidance. The message made no mention of the nuclear torpedo. It made no mention of the argument in the control room. It made no mention of Arkipov's veto. Northern Fleet Command's response, received 8 hours later, was even briefer. Approved. Return site Aguba. Report upon arrival. Then separately, a second message marked, Captain only destroy after reading. Special weapon protocols classified maximum security. No written reports, no discussion with crew. Verbal debrief upon return. In Washington, the CIA's Office of Naval Intelligence filed a report on the incident on October 29th. The relevant excerpt, declassified in 1992, reads, Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine forced to surface in quarantine zone. Submarine appeared to be experiencing mechanical difficulties. No hostile action. Submarine departed after repairs. Assessment. Routine patrol submarine caught by blockade. No strategic significance. The report was 7 pages long. The nuclear torpedo was not mentioned because its existence was not known. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially ended on October 28th when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American pledges not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The world celebrated the peaceful resolution. Kennedy and Khrushchev were praised for their statesmanship, their willingness to step back from the brink, their rational management of an irrational situation. The story became one of diplomatic triumph, of how cool heads and clear thinking had prevented catastrophe. What actually prevented catastrophe was one man in a submarine saying no. The truth began to emerge slowly, reluctantly, piece by piece over the course of 4 decades. The first hint appeared in 1992 when Vadim Orlov, B-59's former communications officer, published an article in a minor Russian naval history journal about his experiences during the crisis. The article was 6 pages long, academic in tone, focused primarily on the technical challenges of maintaining radio contact during submerged operations. Almost as an aside, in the final paragraph, Orlov mentioned a disagreement among senior officers regarding weapons authorization protocols. The article was read by approximately 200 people, mostly retired naval officers and military historians. It mentioned no names, no dates, no specific weapons. It disappeared without wider notice. In 1997, the Russian government declassified portions of the Northern Fleet's operational logs from October 1962. The documents confirmed that 4 submarines had been deployed to Cuban waters and that each had carried special weapons authorized for use under specific circumstances. The protocols for these weapons remained classified. The specific circumstances under which they could be used remained classified. But the existence of nuclear torpedoes, previously a matter of speculation among Western intelligence analysts, was now confirmed. The revelation created barely a ripple in the historical community. The Cold War was over. Russia was struggling with economic collapse and political chaos. The West was focused on the future, not the past. A few academic papers were published. A few documentary producers made note of the information for possible future projects. But the story remained obscure, a footnote to a footnote, interesting only to specialists. The breakthrough came at a conference. In October 2002, 40 years after the crisis, the National Security Archive at George Washington University organized a symposium bringing together American and Soviet veterans of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The goal was to compile a comprehensive oral history, to capture the memories of participants before they died, to document the crisis from multiple perspectives. Among the Soviet participants was Vadim Orlov, now 76 years old, and Ryurik Ketov, commander of Submarine B-4, one of the other Foxtrots in the 1962 flotilla. During a break between sessions, Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, was conducting informal interviews when Ketov mentioned the incident on Savitsky's boat. Blanton, sensing something significant, began asking questions. Ketov, either because he assumed the story was already public knowledge or because he simply wanted to tell it after 40 years of silence, described the confrontation in B-59's control room. He mentioned the nuclear torpedo. He mentioned Savitsky's order to prepare the weapon for launch. He mentioned Arkhipov's veto. Blanton immediately recognized the magnitude of what he was hearing. He arranged for a formal interview session with all available Soviet submarine veterans. Over the next 2 days, 5 former officers from the 1962 flotilla, including Orlov, provided testimony about the nuclear torpedoes, the authorization protocols, and the confrontation aboard B-59. Arkhipov himself had died in 1998, ironically from cancer likely caused by his radiation exposure aboard K-19, and could not provide his own account. But the testimony of his fellow officers was consistent, detailed, and devastating in its implications. The conference proceedings were published in 2003 in a volume titled The Cuban Missile Crisis: New Evidence from Russian Archives. The chapter on the submarines ran 47 pages and included translations of declassified Soviet naval documents, testimony transcripts, and technical specifications of the T-5 nuclear torpedo. The academic press published the book to limited attention. It sold approximately 1,200 copies in its first year. But one person who read it was Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now 86 years old and in the final years of his life, McNamara was haunted by what he read. In an interview with documentary filmmaker Errol Morris for the film The Fog of War, released in 2003, McNamara spoke about the submarine incident for the first time publicly. "We came very, very close," he said, his hands shaking slightly as he held the conference proceedings. "We came within one vote, one man's decision of nuclear war. We had no idea. Kennedy had no idea. I had no idea. We thought we were in control. We were not in control." The interview brought mainstream attention to the story. Major newspapers published articles. Documentary producers began developing projects. Historians began reassessing the Cuban Missile Crisis narrative. The National Security Archive worked with Russian counterparts to declassify additional documents, including Savitsky's personal logs, radio transcripts, and technical specifications for the nuclear torpedo authorization protocols. What emerged was a picture radically different from the established narrative. The crisis had not been resolved by rational diplomacy between two superpowers. It had been resolved by luck, by mechanical failure, by heat and suffocation that forced a submarine captain to surface, and, most critically, by one man who said no when everything in his training, his orders, and his circumstances told him to say yes. Captain Valentin Savitsky returned to the Soviet Union in November 1962. His career, according to declassified personnel records, effectively ended that month. He was reassigned to a training command, a prestigious-sounding position that was actually a dead-end job for officers who had failed or disappointed their superiors. He was never given submarine command again. His personnel file contains a single cryptic notation dated December 15, 1962. Operational judgment questions remain. He retired in 1974 at the rank of Rear Admiral, a respectable rank but lower than his talents should have earned him. He died in 1980 of a heart attack. His obituary in the Soviet naval newspaper Morskoy Spornik was 3 paragraphs long and mentioned no specific achievements. Vasili Arkhipov received no recognition for his decision. His personnel file, declassified in 2002, contains no mention of the confrontation aboard B-59, no commendation, no special notation. He continued to serve in the Soviet Navy, rising to the rank of Vice Admiral, commanding submarines and serving in staff positions. He retired in 1985 and lived quietly in a Moscow apartment, occasionally giving lectures at the Naval Academy about submarine operations. He never spoke publicly about what happened on October 27, 1962. When Russian journalists tried to interview him in the 1990s, after some details of the incident had begun to emerge, he declined. "I was doing my job," he told one persistent reporter. nothing more. The Arkhipov family has preserved a few documents that provide glimpses into his thinking. A letter to his wife dated November 3, 1962, 5 days after B-59 returned to port, contains one relevant passage. I saw men I respected lose their judgment under pressure. I saw how quickly training and discipline can collapse when conditions become unbearable. I learned that sometimes the most important decision is the decision not to act. The letter was published in a Russian military history magazine in 2005. Arkhipov died on August 19, 1998, from kidney cancer. He was 72 years old. His funeral was attended by approximately 40 people, mostly family and fellow submarine officers. No government officials attended, no medals were awarded posthumously. His grave in Moscow's Kolmenskoye Cemetery is marked with a simple stone that gives his name, rank, and dates of service. There is no mention of October 27, 1962. The revelation of how close the world came to nuclear war on that October morning forced a fundamental reassessment of Cold War nuclear doctrine. The protocols that gave submarine commanders independent launch authority were immediately reviewed by both Soviet and American naval commands. The Soviet Navy, in particular, recognized that the authorization procedures for submarine-based nuclear weapons contained a dangerous ambiguity. What constituted sufficient justification for launch? Within weeks of B-59's return, the Soviet General Staff issued revised protocols for submarine nuclear weapons, classified as Special Order 473, Authorization Procedures for Special Naval Weapons Systems. The order, declassified in 2007, established explicit requirements. Nuclear weapons could only be deployed after confirmed receipt of launch orders directly from the General Secretary or the Minister of Defense, transmitted via authenticated emergency action messages, with dual confirmation through at least 2 independent communication channels. The ambiguity was eliminated, individual commander discretion was eliminated. The protocols became as restrictive for submarines as they were for ICBMs. The United States Navy, upon learning the full details of the B-59 incident in 2002, conducted its own review. A classified report prepared by the Naval War College, portions of which were declassified in 2012, concluded that American forces had come within a single Soviet officer's decision of triggering a nuclear exchange. The report noted that U.S. Navy protocols for forcing submarines to surface had assumed those submarines carried only conventional weapons, and that no consideration was given to the possibility that practice depth charges might be interpreted as genuine attack by submarine commanders operating under combat stress and communications blackout. The report led to revised rules of engagement for anti-submarine operations during crisis situations. The revised ROE, still partially classified, reportedly require explicit authorization from National Command Authority before any action is taken against submarines that might be carrying nuclear weapons, and mandate the use of underwater communication buoys broadcasting messages in multiple languages to inform submarine commanders that they are not under attack before any forcing action is initiated. The broader strategic lesson that nuclear crisis management depends not just on presidential decision-making, but on the judgment of individual officers in circumstances that Washington and Moscow cannot control, reshaped how both military establishments thought about nuclear command and control. The emphasis shifted from rapid response to deliberate decision-making, from decentralized authority to centralized control, from hair-trigger readiness to survivability and communication redundancy. Modern nuclear submarines carry weapons thousands of times more powerful than the 15-kiloton torpedo aboard B-59. A single Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine carries 20 Trident II missiles, each with multiple independently targetable warheads, a combined yield sufficient to destroy every major city in a target nation. The authorization protocols for these weapons are now among the most carefully guarded secrets in military history. But former submarine commanders who have spoken anonymously to journalists have indicated that the protocols require authenticated orders through multiple independent channels and dual officer authentication at multiple stages. The possibility of a single submarine commander independently deciding to launch has been, to the extent possible, eliminated. Yet the fundamental vulnerability remains. Submarines are designed to be isolated, to cut communications, to disappear beneath the waves. The very characteristics that make them effective deterrents also make them potential sources of accidental war. In crisis situations, when radio communications are jammed or disrupted, when submarine commanders lose contact with their national commands, the same questions that confronted Captain Savitsky on October 27, 1962, reappear. Has war already begun? Are we under attack? Do standing orders apply? The legacy of Vasili Arkhipov is, paradoxically, both commemorated and forgotten. He appears in no monuments, gives his name to no ships, is studied in no military academies. The submarine service, both Russian and American, remains uncomfortable with the story because it reveals how fragile the chain of command becomes under extreme pressure, how close the world can come to annihilation based on the judgment of men who are suffocating, exhausted, and cut off from their leaders. But among nuclear policy analysts, among historians of the Cold War, among those who study how humanity has managed to avoid destroying itself despite possessing the weapons to do so, Arkhipov occupies a unique position. Thomas Blanton, the historian who first documented the B-59 incident comprehensively, has called him the man who saved the world. Robert McNamara, before his death, said that Arkhipov's decision may have been the single most important moment of the Cold War. The director of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, former Senator Sam Nunn, has said that the Arkhipov incident should be required study for every person who has any authority over nuclear weapons. The number that haunts anyone who studies the incident is this. If the torpedo had been launched, if the 15-kiloton warhead had destroyed the American carrier group, the United States would have assumed the Soviet Union had initiated nuclear war. The American response would have been immediate. Strategic Air Command bombers would have launched, Minuteman missiles would have been fired, Polaris submarines would have unleashed their payloads. The Soviet Union would have detected the launch, would have assumed it was under full-scale attack, would have fired its own missiles. Within 30 minutes, every major city in both nations would have been targeted. Within 2 hours, most of them would have ceased to exist. The population of the Earth in October 1962 was approximately 3.1 billion people. Current estimates of casualties from a full-scale U.S.-Soviet nuclear exchange in 1962 based on weapon yields and targeting plans that have since been declassified range from 300 million to 600 million deaths in the first 24 hours, primarily from blast and thermal effects. Long-term casualties from radiation, infrastructure collapse, agricultural failure, and nuclear winter effects would have added substantially to this total. Some climate models suggest that the smoke and debris thrown into the atmosphere would have created a nuclear winter lasting several years, with global temperatures dropping by as much as 20 degrees Celsius, crop failures worldwide, and mass starvation affecting populations far from the blast zones. Recent climate modeling studies, published in 2014 in the journal Earth's Future, suggest that a U.S.-Soviet nuclear exchange using the arsenals available in 1962 would have injected approximately 150 million tons of smoke into the stratosphere. The resulting cooling would have reduced global agricultural productivity by 90% for at least 3 years. Total human mortality, including both immediate casualties and subsequent famine, could have reached 2 billion, roughly two-thirds of the global population at the time. One man stood between that outcome and survival. Not Kennedy, not Khrushchev, not the diplomats negotiating at the United Nations, not the intelligence analysts tracking Soviet missiles. One man in a submarine, suffocating in 122-degree heat, being ordered by his captain to launch a nuclear weapon, with every incentive to agree and one overwhelming reason to refuse: the knowledge of what nuclear weapons actually do. The submarine B-59 was decommissioned in 1989 and scrapped in 1990. Nothing remains of it except some photographs in naval museums and a brass plaque that was salvaged from the conning tower now in the Russian Naval Museum in St. Petersburg. The plaque bears the submarine's designation number and dates of service. It mentions no specific missions, no historic moments, no names. The nuclear torpedo from B-59, serial number T5-1962047, was removed from service in 1963 as part of the revision of submarine nuclear weapons protocols. According to Russian nuclear weapons logs declassified in 2009, the warhead was dismantled in 1964 at the Mayak nuclear facility in the Urals. The highly enriched uranium was reprocessed and eventually used in a Soviet nuclear power plant. The torpedo casing was cut up for scrap metal. The USS Coney, the American destroyer that forced B-59 to surface, served until 1973. It was sold to the Spanish Navy, where it served for another 12 years before being decommissioned. It was scrapped in 1986. The practice depth charges it dropped on October 27, 1962. The explosions that nearly triggered World War III were standard ammunition, manufactured by the thousands during the Cold War. There is nothing unique about them, nothing that marks them as historically significant. They rest on the ocean floor of the Atlantic, 3 miles down, corroding slowly in the darkness. In 2006, a memorial was proposed in Moscow to honor Vasili Arkhipov. The proposal came from a group of retired naval officers and Cold War historians who had become familiar with his story through the declassified archives. The memorial would have been modest, a small bronze statue in a park near the Naval Academy, with a plaque explaining what had happened on October 27, 1962. The proposal was reviewed by the Moscow city government's Monuments Committee, debated for 7 months, and quietly rejected. The official reason given was insufficient space allocation in approved memorial zones. The unofficial reason, according to a committee member who spoke anonymously to a Russian newspaper, was that the story remained politically sensitive because it suggested Soviet naval protocols had been dangerously flawed and that the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis had been based more on chance than on leadership. Arkhipov's widow, Olga, lived until 2013. She gave only one interview about her husband's role in the crisis to a Russian television documentary producer in 2008. The interview was filmed but never broadcast. The documentary was canceled when funding disappeared. A transcript was preserved in the producer's files and was later published in a collection of oral histories about the Cold War. In it, Olga Arkhipova describes coming home from work on November 8, 1962, to find her husband sitting at their kitchen table, still in his uniform, staring at nothing. "He looked like he had aged 10 years, she said. "I asked him what had happened on the mission. He said he couldn't talk about it. I asked if people had died. He said no, but that they almost had. Many people. He wouldn't say anything more. For weeks afterward, he barely slept. He would wake up at night gasping as if he couldn't breathe." It was months before he seemed like himself again. The watch that Arkhipov wore aboard B-59, a standard-issue Soviet naval chronometer with a black face and luminous hands, was preserved by his family after his death. His daughter Yelena kept it in a small wooden box with her father's medals and service ribbons. In 2017, she donated it to the Central Naval Museum in St. Petersburg, where it is now part of the Cold War submarine collection. The watch still works. It is displayed in a glass case with a small placard that reads, "Naval chronometer worn by Vice Admiral Vasili Arkhipov during Cuban Missile Crisis operations, October 1962. The placard does not mention October 27th. It does not mention the nuclear torpedo. It does not mention the decision that saved the world. Museum visitors walk past it without stopping, drawn instead to the larger displays, the submarine periscopes, the torpedo cutaways, the dramatic photographs of vessels at sea. The watch face shows 4:15 a.m. That is the time it displays in the museum case, frozen at the hour when Savitsky ordered the emergency conference in B-59's control room, when the question of whether to launch the nuclear torpedo was first raised. Yelena Arkhipova has said she believes her father stopped the watch deliberately at that time, perhaps as a private memorial to the moment when everything could have ended. There is no way to verify this. The watch could have simply stopped on its own. The mechanism is old, and museum conservators have chosen not to wind it for fear of damaging the internal works. But the symbolism is inescapable. 4:15 a.m., the moment when the world held its breath and didn't know it, preserved in metal and glass. Modern historians continue to debate counterfactuals. What would have happened if Arkhipov had not been aboard B-59? The submarine service maintains strict 3-officer authorization for nuclear weapons precisely because of this incident, but in 1962, the protocols were new, untested, ambiguous. If the flotilla chief of staff position had not existed, if Arkhipov had been assigned to a different submarine, if the third vote had belonged to someone else, someone who agreed with Savitsky, someone who believed Moscow's standing orders meant what they seemed to mean, the torpedo would have been launched. The explosion would have occurred at approximately 5 o'clock a.m. local time, October 27, 1962. The USS Randolph, a 27,000-ton aircraft carrier, would have been vaporized along with most of its crew of 3,000 men. The destroyers Coney, Beale, and Murray would have been heavily damaged or destroyed depending on their exact positions. The electromagnetic pulse would have disabled radio communications throughout the task force. The shockwave would have been detected by American listening posts throughout the Caribbean. Strategic Air Command would have gone to DEFCON 1, war is imminent, within minutes. President Kennedy would have been woken and brought to the White House Situation Room. The assumption would have been that the Soviet Union had initiated hostilities. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, PSYOP-63, the nuclear war plan in effect at the time, called for immediate retaliatory strikes against military and urban targets throughout the Soviet Union and its allies. The plan involved 3,200 nuclear weapons delivered by 1,600 bombers and missiles, targeting 1,077 sites in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. Khrushchev, informed that American strategic forces were launching, would have faced the same decision Kennedy faced. Assume the worst, order retaliation, or wait for confirmation and risk being destroyed while waiting. Soviet doctrine at the time called for launch on warning, firing missiles as soon as American launch was detected, before incoming warheads could destroy Soviet missile silos and command centers. The cascading logic of nuclear strategy, the game theory that both sides had carefully constructed to ensure deterrence, would have driven both nations toward total war. Not because Kennedy wanted war, not because Khrushchev wanted war, but because once the first weapon was used, the strategic calculus demanded an overwhelming response. Hesitation meant destruction. Proportional response meant vulnerability. The only rational choice in the terrible logic of mutually assured destruction was to launch everything before the enemy could. One man said no, not to the Americans, not to the geopolitical logic of the Cold War, not to the doctrine of deterrence. He said no to his captain, his superior officer, a man who had the legal authority under Soviet naval regulations to have Arkhipov arrested for insubordination. He said no knowing it could end his career, knowing it could result in court-martial, knowing that if Savitsky was right, if war had already begun, if Moscow was already burning, his refusal would be recorded by history as the cowardice that allowed the Soviet Union to be destroyed without striking back. He said no because he knew what nuclear weapons did to human beings. He had seen it on K-19, had watched men die from radiation, had stood over their bodies as they vomited blood and begged for morphine that wouldn't come because medical supplies were limited, and other men would need the drugs when their symptoms appeared. He had absorbed radiation himself, felt it destroying his body at the cellular level, knew that he was dying slowly from that exposure, and that there was nothing medicine could do to stop it. He understood, in a way that people who had only read about nuclear weapons could not understand, what launching that torpedo would mean. The temperature in the control room of B-59 at 4:45 a.m. on October 27, 1962 was 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon dioxide concentration was 3.8%, high enough to impair judgment significantly. Captain Savitsky had been awake for 39 consecutive hours. He was not thinking clearly. No one aboard was thinking clearly. But somewhere in the suffocating darkness, with explosions shaking the hull and men dying in the compartments, Vasili Arkhipov found clarity. He understood that the most important decision he would ever make was the decision to do nothing. The world did not end on October 27, 1962. Children were born that day in hospitals across the planet. Approximately 350,000 of them, the normal daily birth rate for a global population of 3.1 billion. Those children grew up, had children of their own, who had children of their own. Today, their descendants number in the billions. Every person born after October 27, 1962, roughly 90% of humanity currently alive, exists because one man in a submarine refused to follow an order that seemed entirely justified by doctrine, by training, by the strategic situation, and by the judgment of his superior officer. There is no way to calculate how many lives were saved. The immediate casualties of a 1962 nuclear exchange would have been in the hundreds of millions. The long-term casualties from radiation, infrastructure collapse, and nuclear winter would have been in the billions. But the actual number is larger than that, because it includes not just the people who would have died, but all the people who would never have been born. Every child born after October 1962, every grandchild, every great-grandchild, every descendant stretching forward through time, all of them contingent on that single decision in that single moment. The watch in the museum shows 4:15 a.m. The plaque identifies it as Archipov's watch, notes that he wore it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The visitors who pause to look at it see a timepiece, a piece of Cold War memorabilia, an artifact of a crisis that was resolved through diplomacy and rational statesmanship. They do not see the 122-degree heat, the men suffocating in the darkness, the captain demanding launch authorization, the political officer nodding in agreement, the moment when everything hinged on one man's ability to say no when every pressure told him to say yes. They do not see the 8 billion people who exist today, the current global population, every man, woman, and child on Earth, walking past that glass case, unaware that their existence depended on the decision made by the man who once wore that watch. 4:15 a.m., October 27, 1962, 3 miles below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, the moment when history turned on the judgment of a single human being and the world continued. The watch keeps time frozen at the hour when time almost stopped forever.